Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ARCO Forum. We're very pleased that the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School of Government tonight could sponsor our Heffernan Fellow for this semester. Some of you will know that the Heffernan Fellowship was established by an endowment in 1975 from the Heffernans, and to bring very special guests here for a day or two at a time, and somebody that we can steal away from a very busy professional life and give them a great deal of interaction with the students here at Harvard University. And the special event of the day is also a speech in the forum here, as we're going to hear tonight. I'm particularly pleased to be able to introduce someone that I have personally known and can attest, as many others can, to his extraordinary talents and character. And that is William Gray III, who is currently the President and Chief Executive Officer of the United Negro College Fund, which for 50 years has been one of the key and critical forces in American society to try to help assure that there would be higher education opportunities for African Americans in this country. They, in fact, have raised over $1 billion, and a third of that during his short tenure of our speaker tonight, who is also launching with the organization a new research organization designed to help be sure that we have the best possible Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ARCO Forum. We're very pleased that the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School of Government tonight could sponsor our Heffernan Fellow for this semester. Some of you will know that the Heffernan Fellowship was established by an endowment in 1975 from the Heffernans, and to bring very special guests here for a day or two at a time, and somebody that we can steal away from a very busy professional life and give them a great deal of interaction with the students here at Harvard University. And the special event of the day is also a speech in the forum here, as we're going to hear tonight. I'm particularly pleased to be able to introduce someone that I have personally known and can attest, as many others can, to his extraordinary talents and character. And that is William Gray III, who is currently the President and Chief Executive Officer of the United Negro College Fund, which for 50 years has been one of the key and critical forces in American society to try to help assure that there would be higher education opportunities for African Americans in this country. They, in fact, have raised over $1 billion, and a third of that during his short tenure of our speaker tonight, who is also launching with the organization a new research organization designed to help be sure that we have the best possible information about issues related to the educational needs of children from kindergarten through college. Prior to his current position, William Gray served in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he was elected to be the whip of the majority party, that is the former majority party in the House of Representatives, where he was also elected to be caucus chairman of that party, and those are the highest positions to which any African American has ever been elected. He was also elected to be chairman of the Budget Committee. You will notice that in terms of the House of Representatives, I used the word elected, because most positions of power and influence in the House of Representatives are a matter of simply outliving everyone else and getting it by seniority. There are only a few positions that actually require one to win the support and the trust of your colleagues, and Mr. Gray managed to do that in an extraordinary way in the U.S. House of Representatives. He also, I should point out, is a minister and regularly serves a church back in his home state of Pennsylvania. And indeed, if you go to a Memorial Church in the morning, he will be there at the service here on the Harvard campus. In addition to that, he has had other association with Harvard University since in 1994 it presented him an honorary degree. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable William H. Gray III.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. To all of you who are gathered here, it is a real pleasure and a privilege for me to be a fellow as a part of this Institute of Politics and to have the honor to come and share this podium where some of the great leaders of America have stood and shared their views with you here at this very important institution of learning, Harvard, and especially the Kennedy School of Government. Now, I thought about what I was going to say, and I thought immediately about talking about national politics, and then I realized that the director of this institute is Phil Sharp, a distinguished former member of Congress who knows all about national politics, and I thought, well, I better change subjects because he would be able to evaluate me very closely because he's been there. And then I thought about, well, I'll talk about local issues. And then today I saw the former mayor of Houston, Kathy Whitmire, here, and I said, well, I better change subjects again. And then I said, well, you know, one thing that politicians like to do is criticize the press. And so I'll criticize, what is the fourth or the fifth estate, whichever one. And then I ran into Maxine Isaacs, whose specialty is that. And I said, well, I better not do that because she will know everything and tell you how wrong I was. And then I said, well, I'll talk about the American worker. And then at dinner I ran into Lynn Williams, who used to be the leader of the steel workers. And I said, well, I better change subjects again. And then I said, no problem. I can always talk about the law. And then in walked the giant of the law, Leon Higginbotham, who used to live in my congressional district, and someone I've admired for many, many years. And I said, well, I can't talk about the law. And so I said, well, I can do what I have done for 35 years. I'm a Baptist preacher. I can talk about religion. And then I looked up and I saw Reverend Charles Stith. And I said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. But as a matter of fact, you all are in deep trouble. Because if you really think about it, as Phil Sharp, my good friend, pointed out, my background is, one, I'm a Baptist minister, and you know Baptist ministers take at least 30 minutes to clear their throats, especially in the African-American tradition. Secondly, I'm a former college professor, and you all know that it takes a college professor 45 to 50 minutes to make a point. That's why the classes run that long. And then if you've been watching C-SPAN and watching the national debate in the United States Congress, you know that members of Congress talk and never make their point. And so tonight you have a combination of Baptist preacher, former college professor, and a former member of Congress. I hope that you can stay here until midnight with me as we deliberate the great issues of our time. No, I won't do that, but who knows what's going to happen. I'd like to just talk to you about what I see as the great challenges we face and how we need to meet them in the 21st century. For indeed, the 1990s is a time of preparation for the beginning of a new century, the 21st century. And I believe that there are a series of events that are taking place that will significantly determine whether or not we will have the ability to meet those challenges that we face. And what are those challenges? Well, I think when historians look back and remember the 1990s, they will say that the 1990s were a watershed decade, very similar to the 1940s, perhaps to the early turn of the century, and even to the 1860s. Why? Because we have seen amazing changes take place. First, in the international arena. How many of us would have believed just a few years ago the reality that we would be facing in our global village today? For 50 years, America's foreign policy, and indeed the world's foreign policy, really centered around the axis of East versus West, communism versus capitalism. And that had been the center of all foreign policy. In fact, the world had become sort of a global chessboard where the two superpowers struggled for influence and looked for allies. as they made their strategic moves around the global village. But now, today, communism is in the dustbin of history, and the superpowers have moved back from the edge of nuclear annihilation. Something that has been startling for particularly those of my generation who grew up in a world that was governed by the politics of East versus West. And as one president said, it is sort of a new world order because we don't know what the new alliances will be. But we do know that there are significant challenges, challenges of North versus South, the developing countries versus those countries that are less developed and even those countries that are poor. The challenges of regional conflicts, many of those conflicts that have been kept really in check because of the force of either the Eastern Bloc countries or ourselves. And now suddenly those conflicts are reemerging, and we're beginning to see them in Eastern Europe tear apart that country and redraw the map of Europe. We're also beginning to see developments in Africa that we never thought we would see. Even though I was one of those who worked with people like Phil Sharp on U.S. foreign policy toward Africa and particularly South Africa, and even though I had the privilege of helping to draw up the sanctions bill that eventually became law in 1986, none of us who were on the floor of the House, a part of that debate, and who even designed that legislation, thought that in less than 10 years, Nelson Mandela would be out of jail and be the first African president of the Republic of South Africa, and there was not going to be an absolute bloodbath. And we've seen changes in Asia in terms of geopolitical realities. And the truth of the matter is, we don't know ultimately what will be the new controlling forces that determine our relations. But we do know that there's been a significant revolution, and the United States is faced with new possibilities and new challenges. And one of them is, how do you maintain your world leadership position in light of the fact that you are now called upon to be the, not the policeman, but the power, the superpower that helps the other nations of the world bring about peace. We're seeing that right now in Eastern Europe. It is the responsibility of leadership that comes with being the only remaining superpower that has the ability to help bring about solutions to conflict and the costs that go along with that. Will we meet that challenge? Will America be willing to extend its military power, its diplomacy, work with other nations of the world in order to bring about peace? Or will we retreat into a isolationism that is a part of our past and say, no, let other places solve their own problems? Will we be a country that stands for human rights and the values that we espouse and be willing to implement them diplomatically and, yes, even with power wherever we can, so that we will not have the conflict of talking one way about ourselves and about our world, but then when it comes to nations, even nations in our own neighborhood like Haiti, we're not willing to make the kind of commitment that is needed in our foreign policy to ensure the emerging democracy and outlawing of dictatorship and brutal human rights violations. And then there's another revolution that's going on, and that's the revolution that is symbolized by the economic changes that we've seen in the last decade or so. Those revolutions have led to an America that has changed very much in terms of its economic system. When I grew up in North Philadelphia, which wasn't that long ago, I'm prematurely aging, I just look this way. But back in North Philadelphia, and North Philadelphia was really typical of Houston, and it was typical of Pittsburgh, and it was typical of New York. It was typical of a lot of places, including Boston. If you had a will to work, and if you had a strong back, and if you had strong arms, you could really find a place to go and work and make a decent living. You could make a living just from the sweat of your brow, without a lot of training. You could go to the steel mill, Len. You could go to the automobile factories. You could go to the heavy industries where they were manufacturing those early television sets. And you could make a living that was good enough for you to go out, get married, move out of the household, raise a family, and hope that you would become the supervisor and then eventually the manager and rise through the economic system. But today, we've changed. Those jobs are no longer there. They are gone. Industries are moving across the world in the global marketplace where capital and goods can move instantaneously. And thus, the heavy industry that provided the doorway to opportunity for early immigrants is no longer available for the later immigrants who have come along and who are looking for economic prosperity. Instead, they're either the high-tech or the service jobs that require great skills, or there are those jobs that are at the bottom that require no skills but don't pay very well, and you certainly can't support a family. You can't have the traditional family organization and orientation because we've changed economically. And it also means something else. It means that we are in a much more competitive environment. It used to be it was the folks in the Rust Belt and the Snow Belt fighting with the folks in the Sun Belt. We were always jealous of what they were doing down in Houston and down there in Florida, and they were taking our jobs from, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, the textile jobs, down to North Carolina and South Carolina. And we were always jealous about somebody taking jobs from the Midwest down to the Southwest or out to the West Coast. That's no longer the issue anymore. Now those jobs are offshore. And so what we're seeing is competition that comes from strange places. The Pacific Rim countries, countries that in my generation we never thought too much of, but now they have tremendous economic strength and power. They're standing on the stage with America. Before there was America and, yes, the Soviet Union. But now, today in the Pacific Rim, there's Japan, there's South Korea. And Lord only knows what's going to happen when China gets its act together, which it rapidly is doing, attracting even American industry to build automobiles, low-cost workers, millions of them that will be producing goods and services. And then you look to Europe, and you see an expanding common market, a group of countries that have broken down all the barriers, talking about a common currency, a common political organization, and working together as one gigantic market to compete in the global village. And that's really a major challenge. What do we do to preserve families in that kind of economic structure, where often the economic forces are forces that tend to rip apart traditional family structures? What do we do in terms of preparing people for the new kinds of economic opportunities that will be available, which require high skills, high education in this country if you're going to make it? What do we say to the latest group of immigrants who didn't come from Europe, but tend to come from the Caribbean, tend to come from Latin America, and yes, even tend to come from within the United States? African Americans who were the last to walk into the heavy industry doors, and suddenly those doors are closing, and the good, well-paying jobs that went with them are disappearing. That's a major challenge. But there's another one. Another challenge that I think perhaps is even more important than the first two. And those first two are very significant. And in fact, the other challenge and how we meet that challenge really will determine what happens with the first two. What happens with our global power, what happens with our economic power. And let me tell you and describe to you what that challenge is. I saw it the other day. The truth of the matter is Bill Gray didn't want to be a Baptist preacher. I didn't want to be a member of Congress. I didn't want to be a college professor. What I really wanted to do when I was growing up in North Philadelphia on 16th Street, going to Meade Elementary School and Jay Cook Junior High School, was I wanted to be an airline pilot. I could just see myself now in that bright blue uniform with the gold buttons, flying, and this is going to tell how old I am, that 707 of Pan Am. I used to look up from down in the ghetto of North Philadelphia and think about that's what I really wanted to be. And around the 8th grade or so, they moved me from the front row to the back row. And suddenly I couldn't read anything on the blackboard. And I got these glasses. And back in those days, once you got glasses, there went your airline career right out the window. And so I had to do something else. So I ended up being a preacher. But you know, I still think about that dream that I had. And I suppose that all of those who are around my generation remember some dream that they had when they were teenagers, and it never came to fruition. They never fulfilled it. Not because of anything bad. It's just, you know, your eyes weren't that good. Or you turn left instead of right. And every now and then, as you go through life, you remember the dream. And so every time I get on an airplane, I think about Bill Gray, Captain. And, you know, they always leave the cockpit door open when you get on. They close it when they take off. They don't want you to see what's going on. And every time I get in one of those planes, which is often flying around the country because I fly a lot to raise money to send young people to college, I look in at the cockpit and I think about what might have been. And the other day I got in a plane and I looked in, it was a 727, and I saw the back of the captain, hair all over the ears and over the neck. And I said, what's happening to values? What's really happening to regulations? And then the captain turned around. She was a blonde. And before I could catch my breath, I looked over the first officer. It was a brother. And then I looked, and the flight engineer looked like someone of Asian background. And, you know, I was about ready to get off the plane at that point. And then the young lady tapped me on the shoulder. It was the head flight attendant, and her name was Juanita Rodriguez. And I went to my seat and I said, oh, Lord, this is going to be tough. It was one of the best flights I ever had. They really flew that plane. But you know, that symbolized a revolution that's taking place in the United States, which most of us are only dimly aware of. And let me bring it down front for you. Here's the revolution. In 5 years, we will enter the 21st century. 85% of the new workers that will enter America's workforce will be women and minorities. And demographers are predicting that by the year 2050, 1/2 of the American population will be made up of people who today we call minorities. Think about that. Think about what that means. What a tremendous change that is. And how do we address it? Do we draw the circle closer and try to hold on to a status quo and go back to a good old day when we weren't that good and we certainly weren't that old? And do we say, hey, we got to stop doing some things because we're in jeopardy of losing jobs or contracts? Or do we creatively find ways to expand the circle, to be more inclusive, to make sure that the new generation of Americans who we're going to have to depend on to become the doctors, the lawyers, the public servants, the teachers, the business managers, to run America and make it prosper and grow in that global village? Are they really there? And if we draw the circle wider, it will be. And I suggest to you tonight that that perhaps is the most significant challenge that we face, along with the economic and geopolitical challenge. And it's probably the most difficult challenge we face because of our unique history and heritage as a people. We have never really solved the problems of race in this country. Just think about it. Just a few months ago, here in the United States of America, 1 million African American men marched on Washington, not to ask the government for any special programs, not to ask the government for expenditure of any money, but they marched primarily to make a statement, best made by one of the T-shirts that were worn by some of the people I am a man, I love my family, I don't do drugs, and I go to work every day. Imagine a need for that kind of statement to be made. But it was made. Why? Because if you listen to the debate in 1996, you begin to wonder whether or not we have made significant progress on the issue of race, and whether or not we're willing to move forward. You listen to the discussion of immigration, Prop 187, and those leading the discussion. I can remember when I was in Congress as chairman of the Budget Committee, those who led the discussion recently on 187 used to come knock on my door to talk about, please allow all of the immigrants from Mexico to come up and pick the fruit and the vegetables in the Valley of California, else we'll have no economy. Now, all of a sudden, we want to close our doors to immigrants. Oh, yes, we used to have a debate about immigrants coming to this country. When they came from Europe, it was a debate about, taking jobs. But this is not even about taking jobs. This is a debate that sounds like we don't want them in our country because they are costing us somehow. And then you add to that the debate with regard to affirmative action, which has generated a whole new language, what I call the boutique form of racial discussion, where we don't talk about unpleasant subjects. We use code language, preferences. And so here we are, 25 years after the installment of a program to redress centuries of injustice, which, by the way, was installed not by any liberal Democrat, but I think Richard Milhouse Nixon was the one who did it. And you would hear the debate as if somehow this is a debate between political ideologies, between Republicans and Democrats, when actually the person who designed the program was a Republican, and a rather conservative one, the last time I remember reading my political history. And if anything, if there's a criticism of affirmative action, it's not what it's doing to poor white males. The criticism might be that it hasn't achieved very much after 25 years. Look at the Glass Ceiling Commission's report that came out last year. That was the report that was introduced into the Senate by then Senate Majority Leader Robert Doe, and which was suggested by the Secretary of Labor, whose name was Elizabeth Doe. And after several years, they came forth with a massive study. And what did that study say? It said that after 25 years of affirmative action, i.e. preferences, that we had achieved in the private sector the following results. In the top 1,000 companies of America, 3% of all the executives were women and all minorities. And in the top 2,000 corporations in America, it moved from a whopping 3% to a massive 5%. And then when you factored out white women, the figures were even more revealing. In the 3%, when you took white women out of the equation, it left 1.4% for all the other minorities in America, and including black women. If you took the 5% and factored out white women, it left 2.4% for all of the other minorities and minority women. So thus, after 25 years, we are really turning the country upside down. We are really threatening the survival of men in this country because 3% of the jobs went to women and the minorities. And if you take out the women, and I can't understand why men don't want their wives and their daughters who are going to great institutions like Harvard to become lawyers and doctors not to have equal opportunity, but then it becomes 1.4%. We've even gone so far as to take that discussion to the academy. and somehow bring it right into the halls of higher learning. That somehow affirmative action, as we've seen from the discussion in California, is absolutely the disastrous poison that will ruin the academic well-being of American higher education, and certainly even the faculty, if you continue to pursue it. Well, I don't know about you, but I remember a time when you didn't have to take the SATs in order to get into an American college. In fact, in most colleges in the 1950s, it was only recommended. The SATs and standardization went along with the civil rights and the women's movement as a form of trying to equalize the playing field. In fact, I remember that you often got into college by who you knew and whether or not your parents were alums and whether or not you could pay the bill. And higher education, if you look at the demographics, whether it be the Ivy League or whether it be the Southern universities, really began to open up after the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. And yet you would think somehow that because our universities are more diverse in terms of women and minorities, there's the implied proposition that somehow standards have been lowered. Somehow we are crushing the opportunity and taking away opportunity from poor white men. Now, the one that really gets me the most is the argument that goes, well, you really don't want to be an affirmative action baby. You really don't want to be the beneficiary of preferences, because if you're the beneficiary of preferences, it will stun your psychological development. You will sit in the classroom and you will sit on the job in corporate America and you will look in the mirror and say, I'm here because I happen to be a woman. I'm here because I happen to be Hispanic. I'm here because I happen to be black, and I got an unfair break. And because I got an unfair break, I will sit around and mope and feel sad and be unproductive and be psychologically traumatized. And so thus these, quote, preferences are really dangerous to the recipient. I like that. Especially since in my service in public life as well as in corporate America, I have yet to find any white male ever stand up and say, especially in my age group, I'm guilty. I've had 50 years of preferences where I didn't have to compete on a level playing field with all those women and minorities, and so therefore I'm giving up my chairmanship of IBM. Therefore I'm giving up my presidency. I am giving up my tenure. Because when I came to Harvard 20 years ago, I didn't have to compete against minorities and women for tenure. There weren't any. So I don't see anybody psychologically traumatized. Why am I supposed to be traumatized and feel real bad? Because for the first time, the country is saying, hey, let's draw the circle a little bit wider, and if we really believe in free markets and competition, let's make some real competition. Get everybody who's qualified in the room and let them compete. We're still having a debate in 1996 that we thought some of us should have been over 1963, 64, 65. And believe me, even though it's coded, even though it's dressed up, it's a very dangerous debate because it can cause us to lose sight of what it takes for this country to make it and to prosper in the 21st century. One of the most important things we've got to do is educate a new generation of Americans. And remember I told you the demographic revolution is such that increasingly the people who are going to be the workers in the next century are going to be minorities and women. How stupid it is. How, forget undemocratic, it's just against your own self-interest to try to turn back the clock in 1996 to some bygone era and limit the expansion of opportunity or try to freeze what little progress has been made in place. Because if you do that, my friends, and if the playing field is not level, then you will not have the teachers, the doctors, the lawyers, the public servants, and the business entrepreneurs and the experts that we're going to need in the 21st century to keep this country prosperous and in the forefront. So forget any wishy-washy good feelings. It is in our self-interest as a nation in the 21st century in the global marketplace to make sure that the next generation of workers are prepared. And if most of those workers are going to be women and minorities, we've got to start the work right now. We can't turn back the clock. We can't go back to an era that never was. I love it. Some of these people running for presidents. We need to get back to good old American values. I heard one of them say it the other day, and I felt like saying, boy, where you been? What are the values you're talking about? Are you talking about the values when I rode in the back of the bus? Are you talking about the values when in North Philadelphia I had to walk 30 blocks to South Philadelphia because the only YMCA that would allow me to go swimming was the Christian Street YMCA? What are the values you're talking about? The values that regardless of the fact that I was fourth in a class of 369, 3.75 GPA in high school, high SATs, the only four-letter athlete, editor of the yearbook, vice president student body, yeah, I was bad. But I couldn't go to Duke like Grant Hill. I couldn't go like Michael Jordan, even on basketball scholarship. You notice nobody's arguing preferences and affirmative action on athletics. You notice that? Very interesting, isn't it? The fact of the matter is, we have got to start that investment now. And that's why the budget debate is an important one. We all believe that there ought to be a balanced budget. As a former chairman of the Budget Committee, I certainly believe that there ought to be a balanced budget. And it's too bad that between 1980 and 1990, we tripled the national debt. We went from $914 billion from George Washington to Jimmy Carter. By the beginning of the Bush presidency, we had gone to $3 trillion. Now, you know, you don't need a PhD in economics from Harvard to figure out that something happened in that decade where revenues and expenditures didn't keep up and red ink started growing up. Now, deficits are bad. We want to balance the budget. But the issue isn't whether we want to. The issue is how do you do it? Where do you make the cuts? And who pays? And it seems to me that you don't prepare America for the 21st century if you're going to cut $40 billion out of education, while at the same time leaving $456 billion worth of tax expenditures. That's spending too. That's a different kind of spending. You know, there's two kinds of spending. One where you give somebody a check for some service, you know, welfare. There's another kind where you give them a tax break, okay? That's called tax expenditure. That's what it's called. There are $456 billion worth of tax expenditures in the federal book right now. It comes to $2.5 trillion over 5 years. Now, if you really want to balance the budget, all you got to do is just cut the tax expenditures in half. And if you got rid of all of them, in 5 years, you would have the national debt. In 10 years, you would eradicate the whole national debt. What are the priorities that you're going to select? Who pays? And I want to be very clear. I think it's very good that my former Republican colleagues are talking about looking at entitlements, because that makes up roughly about $800 billion of the federal budget. And they don't go to poor people, by the way, at all. And it's good that we're taking a look at that. And we probably have got to bring that under control. That's good. But at the same time, you're talking about reducing education by $40 billion, and the $40 billion of education reductions that you're talking about are in the area that provide the doorways of empowerment for the next generation of leaders. That doesn't make very good sense, particularly when there are other places. So all I'm simply saying to you is that whole budget debate and what choices you make are very important to America's future. Who cares about CBO versus OMB? We used to call it gray smoke and mirrors. That's only an economic assumption anyway. And any economist will tell you that economic assumptions are only good for a couple of years anyway. After about the second or third year, you're just guessing. Okay? And here we're arguing about whether we're going to use CBO, OMB. Who cares whether it's 7 years, 8 years, 5 years? What's important are the choices you make in order to balance it. And you cannot solve this country's problems by making the choices of cuts that will hurt the future growth and development of the country and the strength of the country, particularly when you leave untouched vast areas, because those happen to be the most politically sensitive and the most politically powerful. Children don't vote. Easy to hit them because they're not going to show up on the steps of the Capitol. But you watch when it comes to taking a tough stance and biting the bullet towards senior citizens. Everybody starts running because they will show up and they will put you out of office. And the same thing with some of the special interest groups that are highly organized. But, you know, education is the key. And many people say to me, Bill Gray, why did you leave Congress? You were the highest ranking black ever to serve in the United States Congress. Because I believe that education is the key. And I believe that those institutions that have been bridges in my community, bringing over thousands of young people, like the historically black colleges, are going to be needed more in the future than they ever have been, especially if we're going to educate everybody who's out there. I'm glad that my children have a choice that I didn't have. They can go to Duke, North Carolina, Florida State University, LSU. That's good. That's what the struggle was about. The struggle was about choice. But it's also a struggle to educate everybody. And that means for me that we need to strengthen every educational institution in America that is doing a good job. These colleges are doing a good job. Most Americans don't know it because we often get into that discussion about other people's institutions in a way that it is negative. Do you know that 80% of all the black physicians in America did their undergraduate work at historically black college? 75% of all the blacks in America who hold PhDs in any discipline did their undergraduate work at a historically black college. 60% of all the blacks who are lawyers did their undergraduate work at a historically black college before they came to Harvard. 85% of all the blacks who serve in the United States military as lieutenant or above did their undergraduate work at a historically black college. I can't for the life of me understand why some folk think that the civil rights movement was about integration. And integration somehow meant that we were going to disassemble black institutions and bridges that brought us over the troubled waters. And therefore they say, why y'all need them black colleges? Well, we need them for the same reason y'all need Holy Cross. Same reason why you need Notre Dame. Same reason why you need St. John's and Fordham and Georgetown down in Washington. The same reason why you need historically Jewish colleges like Brandeis and Yeshiva and historically Mormon colleges like Brigham Young. Why? Because they work. And they take young people from where they are and give them the skills that they need to become the leaders. And any institutions that can do that are important. I'm glad to come to Harvard and look out and see a crowd like this, because 20 years ago I wouldn't have seen this crowd. Y'all know what I'm talking about. It would not have been as rich in color and diversity as it is now. Okay? But the same thing was true at the University of Pennsylvania. That was a part of my district, and Leon Higginbotham knows about. In 1980, which was almost 20 years after the Civil Rights Movement, the total minority population of the University of Pennsylvania was 3%. But after great strides, reaching out, drawing the circle, looking at people differently and how you value them and how you evaluate them, minority enrollment was 13%. And that's good. But one of the major problems we face in this question of race is the coded language. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of lectures on values. I'm tired of somebody lecturing me as if somehow I don't have values and my community and my people are somehow welfare pimping, gang banging, baby making, economically, socially dysfunctional. And that in order for them to get right, they've got to get, quote, somebody else's values. Code. Code. No different than Bilbo. No different than George Wallace. Just code it. Just nicely say it. But I understand the meaning, and so do others. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's over 1 million. Yeah, and it was 1 million. It was not 470, and it wasn't 800 and something. I was there when I saw all those marches come during those years. I was there, and there was more people there than there was for any of the Vietnam marches, any of the poor people marches, Lynn. But they came and made a statement. And let me tell you something. When you look at the statistics don't bear the lecture up. And many of us don't ever hear the true statistics because we're bombarded with images, quick images, electronic images, print images. And so therefore we have bought into certain kinds of stereotypes and beliefs that get reinforced and played for political gain or economic gain. But let me share with you some statistics tonight that you ought to think about. The percentage of black youth who smoke cigarettes is far lower than the percentage of white youth. The percentage of black youth who use alcohol is far lower than white youth. The percentage of black youth who use drugs is far lower in America than white youth. The birth rate of unmarried black women ages 15 to 19 has gone up 16% in the last 15 years. But the rate for whites in the same age group has more than doubled. The number of black children under 18 who live below the poverty level has risen 28% in the past 15 years. The number of white youth in poverty has risen nearly 50%. The percentage of 25-year-old blacks with at least a high school education has risen by 42% in the past 15 years. During the same period, the gains for whites has only been 20%. The gain for blacks with a college degree has been 54%, for whites 34%. The percentage of blacks between 14 and 24 who are high school dropouts has declined by 43% in the past 15 years. And the dropout for whites has been declining only at about 28%. More than half of black high school graduates now go on to college, and a record 72,000 blacks received bachelor degrees in 1992, the latest year for which we have figures. That's up, ladies and gentlemen, by 20% from 15 years ago, whereas the gain for whites in the same period and same category is only 16%. There's another view of what's happening in America. It's not a distorted view. Yes, there's still wide gaps, but the movement is in the right direction. And why? Because this nation made a statement that we were going to draw the circle wider and empower people. And yes, we've made some progress, but we've got a mighty long way yet to go. And I suggest to you that if we're going to meet that challenge of global leadership and whatever the new geopolitical order is going to be, if we're going to meet that challenge in economic leadership and prosperity to give the next generation of Americans, no matter what their color, a piece of the American dream, then we're going to have to solve somehow the fundamental problem that continues to dog our heels and shadows our moral strength, and that is the issue of race and prejudice and bigotry. Because if we don't, we will not lead in the 21st century given the demographics. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. Why? Because I look at figures like this. I look at young people at the colleges where the College Fund has, and I look at young people like those that I've met today here at Harvard, and I see the possibility of a new America, because I have seen a new America. Yes, I remember an America where I had to ride in the back of the bus. I remember an America where I had to go to a different Y. I remember an America where I couldn't go to certain colleges. But I also remember America that elected a guy from North Philadelphia as the chairman of the Budget Committee and as the majority whip. I remember America that has changed in terms of great institutions like this one, Harvard, and an America that could have a Colin Powell as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I am hopeful, but I suggest to you that if America is to be great, we can't retreat. We must move forward. And we must do so immediately to make sure that the circle is wider. Why? Because we have a responsibility at the end of the day, regardless of whether we're white, black, regardless of our religious affiliation, we have a responsibility. And that responsibility is to make sure that our next generation has an American dream. And what's that American dream? Despite all the warts and all the problems we may have had in this country has been the greatest country in the world because of that dream. And what was the dream? No, it wasn't the little white house with the picket fence and the grass. What the dream was whether you came on an immigrant ship or whether you came on a slave ship, that if you worked hard, you persevered, you achieved excellence, you could be a little bit taller, go a little bit further, and a little bit higher than your forebears before you. That's the promise of America, which we must keep to the next generation. And as difficult as it may be to resolve the problems, that's our greatest challenge. But if we meet it, then we will have truly an America that is stronger and better to pass on to our children and our children's children. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, if you'll please come to one of the two microphones here and briefly identify yourself, and if you'll kind of try to keep your questions short so that we can maximize the number of participants, we'll appreciate that.
Let me start right here.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay.
You're okay? I'm okay.
Everybody's wonderful. I'm Lou Green, and I am a student here at Kennedy School of Government. I'm from Arkansas. And I had a question about de facto versus de jure discrimination. It seems evident to me that we've done quite a bit to rid this country of de jure discrimination, although we're not finished yet. I was wondering what things, based on the educational plank you discussed this evening, could we do to ensure the eradication of de facto discrimination?
Well, first of all, you got to understand how insidious it is, how deep it is embedded in American society, in ways that are very subtle, and ways that are not so subtle. From the bell curve kind of mentality, which is nothing but an old form of racism that talks about the inferiority of people based upon nonsense, to the new debates with regard to legislative gerrymandering, which is a new, more sophisticated way of raising its same ugly head. And I'm talking about the elimination of certain congressional districts because they have too many people of the same race or the same ethnic group. I think that where education plays a role, it's not a panacea that will solve all problems, for the African American community or for women in America, but it takes you a long way towards solving them because you're able to break all the stereotypes and you're able to have the skills that are needed in that society. Ultimately, the way you get rid of all of the residues of 300 years of our history is it's going to take generations. And those of us who were around during the Civil Rights Movement certainly didn't expect America in 30 years to be completely free of any residual problems with regard to sex, gender discrimination, or with regard to racial discrimination. And so what you've got to do is keep fighting it, confront it wherever it is, and no matter how sophisticated it may look, call it what it is. And then teach the history. See, that's one of the big problems that we have today in today's debate is a lot of people don't understand how certain things came to be. And so you can have people get up and tell a lie that, you know, this is really a debate between liberals and conservatives. Huh? When Nixon was the one who did it? Sure. Lyndon Baines Johnson was the one who said in 1965 he passed an executive order saying end all discrimination, period. But it was Richard Milhouse Nixon who in 1970 said after 5 years there hasn't been any progress, so we need goals and timetables. All right? So this is not a debate between, quote, liberal and conservative.
Right.
It never was. And we don't teach, particularly to our young, things about our history that we don't like. We don't teach the pain. And I suppose you got to have a myth, you know. We all live by myths. You all, some of you here are too young yet to have developed your myth, but you know, the older you get, you'll get a myth. You know, the view of what you used to be. You know, I invented the 360-degree tomahawk dunk back at Gratz High School. I don't care what Julius Erving did. Of course, there's nobody in this audience who played basketball the same time I did who could get up and say, Bill, that's a lie. But that's my myth. Okay, and societies live by myth, you know, and they have to. But at the same time, there's got to be enough honesty, particularly to teach to a new generation. Why do we have certain things? And when did we get the standardization that now is being held on to so tightly as, quote, the only measure of a person's worth for admission into the academy? That came along in the Civil Rights Movement and in the Women's Movement. Because the old person's network was what was used before those movements to determine who got into what colleges. Okay? And so if people were taught that, people say, oh, okay, that gives me a better understanding. I just think it's something that you got to continually fight. There's no easy answer, and you're not going to get rid of the residue and the de facto race, sexism, and prejudice in American society overnight. You didn't do it with other groups in this country. There are still pockets of anti-Semitism. There's still pockets of anti-Catholicism in this country. Okay? And there were no laws that instilled it in our institutions. So many groups are still fighting, you know, residues. We are only 30 years away, folk. I know that's hard for y'all to believe in this country. Because, I mean, y'all look at Florida State's football team, Charlie Ward, all them black boys. Y'all look at Kentucky. You know, whole daggone team, Kentucky, black. Well, I remember in the 1960s when I was in graduate school, how I was sitting up one night going nuts, really going nuts, cheering as a little historically black college, okay, called Texas Western, made it to the Final Four, and guess who they played in the finals? Kentucky. Y'all hear Pat Riley? Pat Riley was All-American on that team, never won the national championship because this little black school beat them. And none of the students who were on Texas Western's team could go to the University of Kentucky. That's just 30 years ago, folks. Now, why is it that we think somehow 30 years later, all of that that's been built into a society is going to be eliminated? You got to keep fighting. It takes time. And I think education is one way to provide a vehicle for people to develop skills to fight it. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Congressman Gray. My name is Judy Canales, and I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School, and I'm from South Texas. And
You know about Texas Western, then?
Actually, I'm UT Austin.
Okay.
That's my school. I appreciate very much the comments that you made about what you would like to see about this in regards to this country and this nation. And I believe that much of this can be accomplished through coalition building. And a lot of what we do here at the Kennedy School is towards that end as far as coalition building. Could you comment on that as in regards to your work in the Congress and now as director of the United Negro College Fund, in working with, for example, historically Hispanic colleges and universities and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's key. You've got to have coalitions in a pluralistic democracy, and you've got to have civility so that you can have those coalitions, and so people can come together, identify their common interests, and work together. In Congress, the only way government works in a democracy is by building coalitions. I mean, that's the fundamental glue of a democracy. And we're seeing right now in the United States Congress a new kind of phenomenon where people don't want to compromise. And without compromise, you can't have a democracy. People have got to adjust their views in order to come to some common understanding in order to do something. So what I used to do all the time, you know, as chairman of the Budget Committee, is you try to shape a budget, $1.2 trillion, that represented a viewpoint where people say, okay, Gray, I'm not satisfied with those 8 things, but I like those 20. And so I'll vote for it because you're not going to satisfy everybody. But you've got to understand that at some point in the political process, in a democracy, you have to come and say, I didn't get everything I wanted, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. Let me take that and move to the next battle. And that's what democracy is. One of the things I'm most concerned about in recent years is the lack of civility and respect that seems to be pervasive in the political process, which is therefore hampering compromise and the ability to come together. And of course, the use of the 30-second, 60-second attack ad, which can totally distort a person's position, and you can't even respond to it often, tends to hurt that process. It's essential to American politics. You've got to have it. Secondly, with regard to the college fund, even though our colleges are called historically black colleges, they are actually perhaps more integrated than America's majority institutions in terms of students and faculty and administrators. Black colleges have about 11% of their student body is white compared to America's majority institutions where it's 6% black. At UNCF colleges, almost 30% of our faculty are white. Whereas at majority institutions, it's usually somewhere in the neighborhood of about 4%. Administrators, 16% of our administrators are white, whereas administrators in majority colleges who happen to be black happen to be about 1%. So, you know, don't get hung up on the name historically black, okay? If you look at numbers, and if numbers are important to you, there's much more integration. But we also form coalitions. For instance, we are currently working with the HACU, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, because one of the things that we find is that there are some common points. And in fact, at some of our schools, the fastest growing population is Hispanic. Down there in Texas, in Austin, Texas, there's a little school called Houston Tillotson. Up in Dallas, there's a school called Paul Quinn. And at those 2 schools, the fastest growing population is not black, it's Hispanic. And in fact, the president of Houston Tillotson said if the growth continues, he expects in 5 years that the majority of the students at Houston Tillotson, a historically black college, will be Hispanic. And these students fit exactly the same demographic profile as the black students. They're first in their family to go to college, extremely low income, very few support systems, and who think that they, for whatever reason, money and size, can't make it in the University of Texas across the street in Austin, where it's 40,000. And so we have those coalitions. We also have coalitions, and we work with majority institutions to build bridges between our colleges, between graduate schools, for instance, where our colleges act as feeders for graduate schools at majority institutions. For instance, most people don't know it, but the #1 school in America that produces black applicants to medical school is a college down in Louisiana called Xavier. In Xavier, they have 850 biology majors who are black, which is more than the entire number of black biology majors in the Ivy League. Okay? But that's especially. And so a lot of students choose to go to Xavier because they know it's a top-notch school and you'll get into med school. And so Xavier has relationships with a number of prominent med schools, including the Ivy League. In fact, the University of Pennsylvania, my old congressional district, at one point, 1/3 of the black students at the University of Pennsylvania Med School came from Xavier because they had a program working together. Tougaloo, down in Mississippi, has a relationship with Brown. Okay? And so we encourage those building of bridges for exchange of faculty, exchange of students, and for graduate study. And we also do the same thing internationally as well, because we want our students, when they graduate, to be ready to go into the real world. And the real world is a big world where you've got to be able to deal with a variety of people and challenges. And so coalition is absolutely critical at the College Fund. We do it at the graduate level, we do it at the undergraduate level, and as I tell people, there are 107 or so historically black colleges, but 4 of them are now predominantly white, including my father's alma mater, Bluefield State College. I went there the other day to speak. 85% of the students are white. And what happened was, but it just goes to show you what happens when you get rid of an illness. There was an illness called segregation and racism. So all the coal miners, poor coal miners in West Virginia, who couldn't afford to send their kids down to Morgantown to the University of West Virginia, they never got a chance to go to school, even though there was this black college sitting right there on top of the mine. Once you got rid of segregation, and folks realized, wait a minute, Bluefield State is certified and accredited by the same association that accredits University of West Virginia? Honey, you get in the little pickup with the doggy, with the gun rack, and go on down there and get an education, and it costs about 1/4 of what it costs the University of West Virginia. You know? And so when we have the meeting of the presidents, the president, Bob Morse, I think it's Bob Morse of Bluefield State comes, historically black college, on the Federal Registry, historically black college. He's white. Okay? And Kentucky State, West Virginia State, Lincoln in Missouri, also overwhelmingly. And that's good, because that's probably the transition that these institutions eventually are going to take, but isn't that the transition that other ethnic institutions took? Even though Holy Cross may have started out to educate Catholic kids who couldn't get into Episcopal schools because they were Catholic here in Boston, now Holy Cross is an institution that serves not only the Catholic community, but the wider community. Same thing with Notre Dame. Same thing with Georgetown. Same thing with Yeshiva, a historically Jewish university, founded because Jewish kids couldn't go. Or they had quotas that acted as a ceiling, okay, to Presbyterian schools in Jersey, like Princeton. Okay? But nobody closed them up. The demographics of the university changed. And so if you go to Yeshiva University, you'll find people who are Jewish, you'll find Catholics, you'll find Hispanics, you'll find Baptists who are black, all getting a great education in an urban environment at a very fine university. That's good. And if you look at the numbers at our institutions, you're seeing the same kind of transitions take place. So coalition building is absolutely key. Yes?
Hi, Mr. Gray. I'm Jim Haskell at Kennedy School. I usually don't do this, but I understand you were Franklin Marshall and Professor Sidney Wise always used to talk about you, so it's an honor to get to meet you.
Did you go to F&M?
Yeah. And not many people here did, so it's always nice to... Oh, okay.
Where? Is there someone else? Did I hear another voice? Where's that other voice? A diplomat.
Anyway,
I hope when you went, she was there, because when I went, it was all male.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to ask you a public policy question about something actually you may not deal with as much now, but you did probably in your previous role. And that is, I've always been interested in the question of things like enterprise zones and why a majority of the African American leadership in organizations, either in political office or private organizations, seem to oppose such things. And it always struck me as something that if you go into public housing projects, it's still, I don't know the percentage of African Americans in public housing projects as compared to whites or other ethnic groups, but
There are more whites in public housing in America than
okay,
blacks.
well then I would actually ask the same question to whites then, and that is, what is the resistance to people of enterprise zones? It seems to offer all advantages of empowerment, of your own self-authority, and so on.
Well,
And
let me just tell you something. Let me dispel that rumor. I am the original sponsor of the Kemp Garcia Gray Enterprise Bill in 1979. It was proposed by Jack Kemp, a Republican. There were three names: Kemp, Bobby Garcia, Hispanic from New York, and Bill Gray, a Democrat from Philadelphia. I'm an original sponsor, before Ronald Reagan even knew what an enterprise zone was. So, I mean, people who say blacks, this morning I was still black.
Well, let me ask you then, why?
But I'm an original sponsor. Charlie Rangel was a major sponsor, helped to shape the legislation and get it through Congress as a senior member. So it would be wrong, I think, to say that blacks did not support enterprise zones. They did. What they had concerns about were specific features of the zone, which was, and I'll tell you what some of them were. When the enterprise zone was originally planned, there was no training component. So therefore, local residents would not probably get a shot at the jobs because you would not have a training component. Okay. Secondly, there was no component in it to provide for the community to be a part of the empowerment zone so that they could do things to the community to help improve it, so that you would have a supportive residential community around, quote, the free enterprise zone. And those are the kind of issues that we raised with Jack Kemp, and Jack changed the bill. I know he changed it for me because I said, Jack, I'll support it if you make available resources in the bill to train local residents. I mean, I don't want to put an enterprise zone in North Philadelphia where companies come and drop something down, build a wall around it, and folk come from the suburbs, drop in, work, and drop back out. And then they look around and say, but the people here in North Philadelphia can't do anything because they don't have the skills. Now, I don't mind giving all those tax breaks, provided I'm going to get some jobs. But to get some jobs, you got to have some skills. So if you don't have job training as a component of it, then who are the people that will get the jobs? The already skilled community, which will be coming in on the expressway or coming in on the train, the subway, dropping in, get the money, and back out. And Jack said, you know, you're right. Didn't think of that. But that's, again, goes back to the question about coalition building and compromise. So blacks did support that bill.
We have time for one more question. Congressman Gray, Mr. Chairman, as I knew him in the House of Representatives, he's got a very important family celebration tonight to go to yet. So.
Okay.
Reverend Gray, good evening. Joshua Joseph from Opelousas, Louisiana, and a proud graduate of Southern University and A&M College in Baton Rouge by choice. One of the things in meeting the challenges, and you talked about the role of historically black colleges and universities, how is it or what is it that must be done for us to maintain our focus and be true to our historical mission in the face of changing economic, social, and political pressures, and at the same time rise up and meet the challenges and the critiques of others, both insiders and outsiders, that indeed we aren't meeting the mission and that we are inferior institutions? What is it that we will have to do in the future and continue to do to show and prove? What are those major challenges that you see facing us?
Well, first of all, you've got to start from the premise. You know, again, it goes back to what I call the value issue. And you've got to start off from the premise that they're not inferior. They're just as good as Harvard. In fact, it is more difficult for a black male to get into Morehouse than it is for him to get into Harvard. It is more difficult for a black woman to get into Spelman than to get into Vassar, because the GPA, as well as the SAT score average for the freshman class, is higher. Now, most people are shocked by it. They go, what? Yeah, it is. And in fact, most of the people who go to Spelman and Morehouse have rejected Harvard. I mean, they got accepted. and for whatever reason decided they wanted to go to Morehouse or Spelman. All right? That's why Morehouse is number 2 and Spelman number 3 on the list of producing black doctors. Xavier is number 1. Okay? And people don't know that. Why? Because they make an automatic assumption. That gets back to what I was trying to talk about, that coded language about value of your institution. And that's why I ticked off all of those figures, because they break all of our stereotypical assumptions about the black community, you know, and about black institutions. So first, I start from the premise that they are good, solid institutions. They are accredited by the same accreditation agency that accredits Duke, University of North Carolina, Emory, and Georgia Tech. All right? And so the question then becomes, what can those institutions do to improve opportunity? The biggest thing that they can do is have the capacity to take in more students. And that becomes financial. The issue, the biggest barrier to the black community to higher education is not will, not desire. It's money. It's money. And one of the reasons why our colleges are growing at 28% over the last 5 years compared to the national average of about 14 or 15% is because they are an absolute bargain. The average tuition is $5,000 a year. And if you're talking about a low-income community, an economically disadvantaged community, the most important hurdle you've got to overcome is what? Money. And, you know, this is a great institution. And I would recommend it highly. Harvard, I got a degree from Harvard now. I'm sort of an alum, I suppose. Okay? It is a preeminent higher education institution in America. But what's tuition, room, board, and all fees? 29, 30? 34? Is that what's spending money? Okay. Well, if let's just say it's $30,000 a year. Do you know what the black family median income is? It's a little over $30,000. The average black family. So even if a black family has a youngster, you know, who wants to go to Harvard, accepted to Harvard, and even if Harvard says, we're going to give you a full tuition scholarship, $18,000, that family still has to come up with what? 12, without spending money. And if their gross income is $33,000, gross before taxes, and if they got 2 people. So one of the reasons why we're having a resurgence at HBCUs is because of cost. And people have also begun to recognize the excellence. And so what can these institutions like Southern University, where my father taught and my mother was dean, and 8 members of my family on my mother's side went to get their schooling, all right, is that those schools need extra resources, mainly for scholarships, so that they can say to low-income young men and women where the family income is extremely low, at UNCF colleges, 50% of our students have a gross income of under $25,000. That's right. So even a $5,000 or $8,000 school bill is a big stretch. And so what we need is scholarship money. What we need is grant money. What we need is that kind of money, even more so than loans, because loans is a middle-class phenomenon. It's not a working-class, lower-income phenomenon. You know, people like Phil here knows how to go to the bank and borrow $100,000 and not worry about it. You know, that's life. You know, he's done that many times. And he doesn't worry about whether he's going to pay it off. You know, but if you're from a low-income family and you've never bought a house, you've never bought a condominium, you know, the biggest thing you've ever bought was a 5-year-old used car. Okay? To suggest to a parent, go borrow $30,000 to pay the tuition at Harvard and fees. Huh? I mean, that's fine. And so what you really need is more grant money and that kind of money. And that provides the access, and that's what I would suggest that you need to do. But that's not only true for HBCUs. That's also true for majority institutions. How do you make it possible for terribly bright, talented young men and women to come to Harvard when they come from low-income families? If you don't have scholarship funds available, then what you will end up having is a homogeneous institution where most of the people look alike, act alike, talk alike, come from the same kind of background, which is not necessarily good for providing the kind of education and skills that you're going to need going into a pluralistic society. You know, you get in a law firm and find out what those folk doing here. Never saw any of them before. Okay? You know, so that becomes a real problem. And one of the things that concerns me about the current budget debate and the current priorities is one of the places where a lot of cuts are being made in education are in resources that will be targeted toward low-income people that would provide them the access not only to our colleges but also to the Harvards of the world so that they could get a fine education like you. And so what can we do? I think the primary thing, kind of thing that I'm enjoying doing, which is basically running around the country begging people to give money, so that young people can become doctors and lawyers. And let me conclude by telling a story, because I was going to tell it in my presentation. Because one of the things that we've done in this country, and it's also part of the whole racial coding thing, but it even goes beyond racial coding, is the kind of view that we have of people. When the Rodney King incident took place in California, we at UNCF said, how do we respond to that? And so we went out and started talking to folk, and they said, do what you normally do, which is education. And so we said, okay, let's do something creative. So we called together 9 inner-city principals from Los Angeles school system, found out that 6 of them graduated from our schools. And we said, what could we do? And they said, do something, Bill, non-traditional. And I said, what do you mean? They said, not the bright student. The student's got the 3.5, the 3.7, not the student who's got the 1,200, 1,300 SATs. What these communities need is some hope for the kid at the bottom. So we got together and started working. We came up with a program that we called Ladders of Hope. It was going to be a non-traditional student program. And we were going to find students who, they couldn't have an average over 2.2. And we'd go all the way down to 1.6. And basically, we left it to the principals. We said, find the students. You know students in Dorsey High School, Crenshaw in South Central, Manuel Freeman, all those schools who are doing terrible grade-wise, not thinking about going to college, but you know that that kid, if given the right environment, the right support system, could do well in college. And so they selected 39 kids. We went out and raised about $3 million. And I got my presidents, that was hard, to say, would you take one of these kids on a provisional admittance? Because they wouldn't qualify in our schools. And just, would you take one? Conditional. They said, sure. We got a professor to be their mentor. We got a kid from Los Angeles to be their buddy. We bought them a wardrobe, just like everybody else. We got somebody to give them a wardrobe. We got somebody to give them luggage. We got an airline to give them tickets so that at Thanksgiving and Christmas they wouldn't be there while everybody's going home. They could go back home. We even got a company to give them a little credit card with a limit so that they can make calls back home like everybody else, And we sent them off. That was 3 years ago. I remember one of them. She was a girl named Tanya, a little wisp of a thing, about 85 pounds soaking wet. And I remember that she couldn't even look you in the eye. She was just, when she taught. And her principal said that when she called Tanya in to tell her that she was going to get a chance to go to school, she called her grandmother. Couldn't call her mother. Mother's a crack addict. Hardly ever sees her. Never knew her father. And said, Granny, I told you I should have stayed in school. I'm going to get a chance to go to college. She had a 1.6 GPA. Well, I saw her about 5 months ago. I was out in Los Angeles to see the kids before they went back for their junior year. And Tanya could look you straight in the eye, confident. And she wasn't interested in getting married anymore because she's going to be a pediatrician. 3.4 GPA. Out of the 39 kids, 32 of them are still there. 5 of them made the honor roll. 3 of them have become their class presidents. And these are all kids who, quote, according to standards, who somebody thought up in some room somewhere would write them off and throw them away. But Tanya might end up here at Harvard, at med school, after she graduates from Talladega, down in Alabama. Why? Because somebody unlocked all of that potential. And I submit to you that there are kids all over this country. And not just black kids. Not just in Roxbury, North Philly, the 5th Ward of Houston, South Central, but also white kids who, if given the opportunity and given the support systems, can become the doctors, the scientists, the lawyers, the public servants that we're going to need in the 21st century. And it seems to me that one of the great challenges we have, especially if we're going to lead in that 21st century, is to make sure, and that's what our mission is at the College Fund, is to make sure that the best and the brightest get a shot, but also the rest get a shot. Because we know that in the rest, there's some Nobel laureates. We know that in the rest, there's some Emmy Awards, there's some Pulitzer Prizes. There are some people who one day can help solve the problems of this country. And that's what our mission is at the College Fund. Thank you.